In what you do day to day, you're helping people onboard to Bitcoin in many different ways, from setting up mining pools to custody to just thinking through the asset.
I often like to call Bitcoin the Entropy engine. It's an incredibly helpful tool for us to find all the other pockets of energy that we haven't quite utilized on the planet yet and make use of them.
What you explore in the book, it all centers around this kind of counterintuitive idea of the ability for our advancement in technology to actually support a healthier way of living.
Modernity is making us quite sick, and I think that's true both from a mental point of view, a mind-body point of view. I propose that is the invention of the fundamental solution to that problem.
Welcome back to Hosting Bitcoin, where we explore the frontier of freedom, energy, and the inner work that it takes to build things that last. Today's guest is someone who doesn't just speak to client success, he embodies it. Sydney Bright is the client success lead at Abundant Minds, where he helps investors navigate the world of sovereign Bitcoin custody, strategic Bitcoin mining, and long-term generational wealth. But that's just one layer of his story. He's also the author of a new book called The Ancient Way of the Mind, a groundbreaking piece that explores a hypothesis that our ability to interpret reality with clarity is tied to how we regulate our minds and is achieved through altering our relationships with our own thoughts. Now, in a world flooded with stimulation, Sydney proposes that our ancestors understood something about consciousness and coherence that we've forgotten, and that we can reclaim it both through ancient rituals and practices, but also through the proper use of new technology that we are building today. And today, we're diving into the world of ancient wisdom, into the mind, overstimulated modernity, and how Bitcoin might be part of remembering who we really are. Sydney, it's an honor to have you on the show. Let's get into it, my man.
Thank you for having me.
We have a lot to talk about today. I have the privilege of knowing you personally. We've gotten a chance to know each other over the last year, and so there's a lot that we could cover, not the least of which is going through what you've compiled into this beautiful book that we have displayed here. But if you don't mind, I would like to start off with your personal background, your story. Like, how did you grow up? How were you influenced? What did you study? What brought you to this point of being squarely in the Bitcoin space and working here and writing this book?
Sure. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I went to a Chinese immersion elementary school. So when I was growing up, all my teachers were Chinese. Almost all my classmates were from China. Every day, school was something where I spoke Chinese every day, and everything was in Chinese. And so I was very much immersed in Chinese culture from a young age. Fast forward, by the time I'm in middle school, the 2008 crisis happens, and I started to become very interested in politics and economics, and I began to study that subject. Fast forward a little more, I arrive in high school, and I am now reading Austrian economic literature and diving deep into the history of money, the Federal Reserve, all that kind of stuff. And that's when I start to understand and grow a great interest towards how broken money really is. But I don't see a career path for me in that area. I didn't really want to be an economist and just talk to kids about economics, right? So I decided to pursue another passion of mine, which was medicine. I was very interested in neuroscience and how the brain worked. Back then, I thought I wanted to be a brain surgeon and work on the brain all the time. So I went to school to study anatomy and physiology. But as time goes forward, I start to study Bitcoin more. That previous passion starts to ignite even further. And I eventually get a master's in biomedical engineering, but at that time I write a paper about how mindfulness meditation is able to alleviate anxiety and depression. At this time, though, I'm also just very invested into studying and understanding how Bitcoin works. And so by the time I graduate, both of these subjects are very, let's just say I've dived down two very big rabbit holes at the same time.
So when it came to these two, we'll call them parallel tracks, the sort of natural and health focused track, the understanding of the mind and the body, as well as the understanding of economics, how money worked, how our systems of organization work. What were the early experiences that called you to this? Did you feel like it was just this intuitive draw? Did you have like an early experience? I know you had a chance to go to the nation's capital with your dad early on, that was one of these kind of aha moments of understanding around economic systems. But were these just kind of gradually seeds planted and you getting interested in them? Or was it sort of like a natural pull? Like, how is the process of you getting deeper into both of these topics?
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect upon. I remember when I was entering high school, I had a friend reach out to me, and she told me that she had recently visited a psychiatrist or something, and that psychiatrist told her that she had depression and therefore she had to take these medicines. And I remember very early on back then, I had an intuition that something about that was very incorrect about how you interpret the mind, how one should have a relationship with the mind, and therefore a relationship with these, so-called medicines that are supposed to at least, supposedly help the mind. And I think I always had a very deep intuition that health was best optimized in nature somehow. Imagine by the time I'm in high school and I'm now very, very intensely studying economics, excuse me, through the Austrian economic literature, I also start getting very interested in Rastafari culture. And I get so infatuated with that, not only the sort of one love idea that was very peaceful and loving, but also that they seem to express a kind of idea that also everything that is true about health and how you take care of the body and take care of the mind is relates to an orientation you have with nature itself. And all that spoke really true to me. At the same time, right, Rasta culture is also very anti-state and revolutionary in that way. And while I'm reading Austrian economic literature, it's not only anti-state and revolutionary in that way, but it's also very keen to highlight how if an economy were able to structure itself in a very natural way, in the sense that you follow natural rights and no one's allowed to violate the private property rights of anyone else, which seems as if it's sort of a natural state of which human beings wish to interact with one another, the economy is optimized. So there was a very interesting parallel between these two things I really was drawn to, and they both highlighted a kind of anti-authoritarian mindset that was also very much geared towards, look, everything is optimized if we align ourselves with nature.
So you told me that in different points of your life, it felt like you had sort of these two selves. When do you feel like you understood that both this sort of natural medicine path and this sort of free money path or libertarian economic path or Austrian economic path were one and the same? When did that intersection come about?
It happened slowly. Imagine fast forward all to the time when I'm now writing blog posts for myself, both on the subject of meditation and mindfulness and mind-body health, and also writing about Bitcoin. I suppose as I dive deeper into the two subjects, as they fermented in my mind, I started to see how they were related. But it wasn't... It happened very slowly, and honestly, I don't even think that it became very clear to me how related they were until I started interacting with other people who were interested in Bitcoin. So imagine very early on when I'm starting to look for... I leave my medical career, or the career that was based upon my medical training or education. I started going to conferences to network with people in Bitcoin and look for jobs in Bitcoin. And I remember that my first conference I ever went to was in El Salvador. And I noticed something very interesting there where you go to a Bitcoin conference, not every single conversation is going to be about Bitcoin. You're just getting to know people and chatting. And I found that there was it was very easy for me to talk about the ideas of my book with the people there. I found it more easy to talk about those ideas than I had anywhere else. And I started to wonder, why do these type of ideas seem to resonate with this community of people? And I think that slowly started to spark a curiosity of, to what degree and how much are these really related ideas? And maybe I thought of them as two separate intellectual interests of mine, but that they were unified, that I just had to unify them in my own mind.
What made you want to write the book?
I think I just eventually, after a bunch of study and a bunch of writing and a bunch of contemplation about the subject, I really think I came upon an idea that I thought was unique and not being said anywhere else. And I suppose the scientist inside of me just wanted to propose my hypothesis to the world.
So I want you to go through kind of the overview of what you explore in the book. I mean, there's a very wide range of topics, of aspects of life that you cover in this, but it all centers around this kind of counterintuitive idea of the ability for our advancement in technology to actually support a healthier way of living, which I guess based on the title of the book, you would consider the ancient way of the mind. So could you walk me through kind of how the book unfolds, what your central thesis in it is, and then, if you would, just give us some details of what you see as supporting this theory that technology and the ability to live a healthy lifestyle are not necessarily in conflict.
I think it's important to start off. I coined something that I call the calm pond hypothesis. And to get there, I think it's first important to think about, what consciousness is and how one can think about it. And there is someone named Anil Seth who wrote a book, Being You, who I took a lot of inspiration from. And I think his way of articulating what consciousness is very helpful. And I will also say that I find consciousness to be a very difficult word. I find many people have different definitions of what that word really means. In this case, when I say consciousness, I mean the experience of life. And the way I would analogize Anil Seth's point of view is, imagine that we all have a brain and it's stuck inside this dark container of the skull with no real access to the outside world or the internal world of our body, except for the brainstem and the cranial nerves. Now, the brain, being sort of the processor in some ways of the body, even though that's definitely overly simplistic, it needs to understand what's going on in both the internal state of the body and the external state of the world. Imagine that if I were to, bang my finger against a table. It's not like the signal from the neuron on my finger that travels all the way up to my brain carries with it an envelope that says, "Hi, I'm a signal from the finger and I'm a pain signal," or whatever. Right? Your brain is receiving just a flood of neurons all the time. Now, there are some individual tracts of the spinal cord, and obviously cranial nerves do individual things, but in general, the brain is sitting there with just a flood of neurons, and it must interpret and understand what those signals mean. And imagine that the brain is a kind of error prediction model generating thing that is constantly receiving signals. It is reacting from those signals and then error correcting of whether or not that signal, was able to alleviate or change or whatever. And all that type of feedback and error correction manifests within itself a subconscious and conscious understanding of what is happening internally and externally. And that is what we experience as our conscious experience, our experience of life. Now, obviously, some of it's subconscious, but you look around and you see something, and that is the model that your brain created through its lifelong process of error correcting and model creation. Now, the way I frame my calm pond hypothesis is like this. Imagine the brain as a pond, and it is there to interpret all the signals. And so a signal is like a raindrop. And when the raindrop hits the pond, it creates a ripple, and the ripple is the information that the brain uses to deduce what that signal was about. And of course, then it has to do its error correction and all that kind of stuff, the model generation. But imagine now a rainstorm upon the pond and all these individual ripples colliding with one another, creating noise, right? So you can imagine that the more, let's call it mental pollution that is happening in the brain with all the neuronal signals, it makes the brain, it makes it more challenging for the brain to accurately interpret what is both happening internally and externally in the world. And so I think there's a deep relationship between how you could think of the mind as having a spectrum of mindful on one side and a mind that's full on the other. And as you swing toward the mind that's full, the more mental pollution you have, the more the brain is less capable of understanding, from a health point of view, what's inside, right? So imagine that there's all kinds of things happening in the body, and the brain must understand appropriately what's happening in order to respond appropriately. But if it doesn't appropriately understand what's happening, disease or chronic disease or autoimmune disease or all kinds of things can happen. Throughout my book, a large portion of it is just a bunch of, it's just scientific review of studies of how issues can manifest themselves when the mind is not mindful, or at least counterintuitively, or on the other side, when the mind is more mindful, health is improved. Now, to take that back to your initial question, so if my premise is correct, that there is this relationship between how polluted the mind is and how capable it is to both be healthy internally, but also correct in understanding the outside reality, there comes into question, I think that makes evident that the modern world, modernity is making us quite sick. And I think that's true both from a mental point of view, a mind-body point of view, but I also think that's true from a metabolic point of view as well. And I think if you were to look at the trajectory of human history, you could see that this is getting worse and worse over time. So I also hypothesize that ancient people, they were much more on the side of mindfulness all the time. I think ancient life, whether that be hunting or just the general struggles of daily survival, it promoted what we now call mindfulness almost all the time. And I think it was promoted evolutionarily, and it meant that ancient people were far more in that kind of mindset. But as modernity moved forward, as the world became more, not just technological, but as people had to use their minds more and more to construct the thing that we have around us now, that slowly polluted their mind more and more, and that slowly took them away from that more deeper truth and took them away from more fundamental health. Now, I propose that the computer is the invention of the fundamental solution to that problem. So you imagine that, I like to say, we're constructing an ivory tower, but we're getting sick because of what it requires us to do. So what happened was we invented a machine that, Alan Turing called the thinking machine, so that it can lift the burden of thinking off of our shoulders so that we can learn to, we can return to a more ancient way of being without foregoing all the modern benefits that technology and engineering has brought us. And so while most people see technology as this thing that's going to lead us into a very, I don't know, Star Trek-like looking world where everything's technology and everything is dictated by technology and people are becoming cyborg-type people, I actually think the opposite is more likely because our bodies can't handle that, right? I think most of those ideas stem from a misunderstanding about how health works and how the human body works, but that the reason why we're almost unconsciously building this thinking machine is because we're trying to create the cure so that we can lift that burden of thinking off of our shoulders so we can return to the forest while not, again, foregoing any of the modern luxuries.
So, going back to the source of this problem, or the source of this trend of going away from mindfulness as history's gone on, you use the example of hunting, which I think is really interesting. If you can go deeper into why that evolutionarily is a form of mindfulness, and then obviously we've adopted these practices of meditation, of intentionally getting into this mindful state as a sort of compensation for life naturally taking us out of it. But could you talk about why, in a little bit more detail, we were sort of wired for mindfulness, and maybe even compare us to animals, as I've heard you compare the way that our state of mind has been influenced by society, civilizational advancement, all of these things that make up what we consider human life?
Sure. So first, I think it'd be important to define mindfulness a little bit here. Imagine it as a kind of single-pointed awareness where you bring your attention to something in the present. Typically that's breathing, but it doesn't have to be breathing. It could be, the sight of a candle, the scent of a incense, all that kind of stuff, right? It's something that you bring your focus to. And what happens during that moment is, say you're going to sit and you're just going to focus on your breathing, your mind's going to naturally wander. And then the point of a meditation practice is to gently bring yourself back to the present moment awareness of the breathing. And meditation is less about always being great at focusing on the present, but it's a practice of catching yourself when your mind wandered and bringing it back. So you brought up my example of hunting. So I think that our modern, long distance races are anthropologic evidence that mindfulness was the natural state of almost all of those type of activities back then. And the reason why, so imagine, when you watch a race like that, I always thought it was really weird that when the race begins, all the competitors form a single file line in the very center, and they run around like that for a while. Now, of course, it makes sense why they're in the center, because they want to reduce the distance they have to run. But it never quite made sense to me why, they're not trying to pass each other. It would seem as if the person in the front of that line is in a clear advantage over the one in the back. What I learned when I was getting my master's degree, that in non-Olympic competitions, often there are two people in the front of that line that are not competitors, and they're known as pacers or rabbits. And I think rabbits is very indicative of the hunting, parallel. That the point of a pacer is that they are cognitively dictating the pace of the race so that everyone behind them can mindlessly follow them and just mimic their pace so that they can serve as much energy as possible to maximize their distance running. And the reason why there's two of them is because eventually the first one, because he's using that cognitive effort to dictate pace, will tire and he will, turn off. And then the second person picks up the slack. And then when that second person tires and he goes off the track, that's when all the competitors scatter and they race to the finish line. Right? So if that is what we're doing to maximize the efficiency of our running, imagine what a hunter-gatherer would have done, thousands of years ago, especially when you consider that human beings, we performed exhaustion hunting, right? We would chase after the animal for hours until the animal just keeled over and died, or keeled over from exhaustion, and then we killed it and dragged it back home and ate it, right? And imagine, like I said, thinking about it like a rabbit, right? That hunter is just running after that animal and using the animal's pace to dictate its pace. And imagine the thoughts that would exist within a hunter's mind, right? as he's running hours and hours and hours, he is a human being after all. It would be easy for that hunter to think, well, man, I'm getting really tired. That the shade looks so nice. I should just stop and go into the shade. And of course, then, the mind is always going to have that kind of impulse because we're all, not wanting to exhaust ourselves running for, we're all have that impulse to be lazy or, find comfort. And imagine, though, that as he's running, he is reminding himself, no, I need to keep on the present because otherwise I'll starve, right? So there's a constant relationship between focusing on the present, watching the mind wander, saying, no, that's like not helpful, not productive, I'm going to keep running. And a good hunter would train himself to be really good at that. Of course, I think there are other things, right? You can imagine that you're doing it with a bunch of people, and so there's some social pressures like, hey, don't be a wimp and, leave the run. But imagine that in general, hunting is fundamentally a mindfulness practice because you have a single point of awareness and you're practicing not following the indulgences and impulses of your mind in order for survival. Now, the problem with modernity is that not following those impulses are not as critical for survival, and therefore we're allowed to follow those impulses more, which is why I think ancient traditions and ancient cultures, they began to initiate or reinforce those type of practices, like you said, finding the time to actually sit down and do what we call meditation as a way of saying, look, this used to be something that was so fundamental to our life and is vitally important to our health and well-being. But because our modern world, or even it doesn't have to be modern, it could be just post-agricultural society, doesn't dictate that as much, we have to find ways of implementing that within our day-to-day lives as sort of a ritual or a chore.
So I love that in your book you reference the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus of us receiving fire as this gift. But as we all know, fire, as powerful of a tool as it is also this very dangerous thing when left unchecked or not used in the proper way. And in a sense, it seems like that's what the thinking mind has become, is this very powerful tool that left unchecked, if you're talking about the context of a hunt or a long race, it, just metabolically is consuming more energy at rest than pretty much any other part of our body. And we increasingly rely on that mode, that thinking mode, to navigate the modern world, which, as we get more noise in that part of our bodies, in that way of interacting with the world, there's less energy flow through the rest of our system. In a sense, you've got more noise. In your calm pond analogy, it's harder to discern what is noise and what is signal, what is the right thing to act on, and to be able to discern, what is a healthy way of navigating the world. Am I understanding you properly?
Yeah, I even like to point out something that I find very ironic. So, in Eastern cultures, they would describe that thinking part of the mind as the monkey mind, right? Something that swings branch to branch, always just kind of, going all kinds of directions, right? Meditation is a way of training the mind to not follow the monkey mind. And in medical literature, there's a network of brain areas that we call the default mode network. And the default mode network does all kinds of things, but in a simplistic way, you can imagine it as the thing of the mind that constructs the narrative self, right? So I'm Sydney Bright, I'm born in Oregon, I work for Abundant Minds. All these type of things, they are the construct of the default mode network. Now, the reason why it's called the default mode network is because when scientists are studying people and they just, watch brain activity when they're doing nothing, say sitting on a couch and just like letting their mind do what is natural or, sort of normal for modern people to do, they say, oh, well, that's when the default mode network's being activated. It must be our default mode, right? But my fundamental argument is that from an ancient nature point of view, that is not the default mode at all, right? What the default mode is mindfulness, and the default mode network that we call it now is the thing that constructs the identity of the self and that sort of all the ruminating thoughts and all the self-identity and all that kind of stuff. And all that stuff is really intertwined within one network. And what I find very interesting is that both in research involving meditation and mindfulness, but also psychedelic research, you see the default mode network decrease, right? Most people know that when you do either psychedelics or meditation, there is a sense of, egolessness, where you lose the sense of the self, where you become, you start to feel more one with the larger thing,
Mm-hmm.
and you are less attached to that narrative self, right? And so I think there's like a deep fundamental truth there where we all take for granted that we think that this default mode network, again, we call it the default mode because we think that's the normal way of interpreting reality, yet meditation and all these other kind of rituals, they were meant to remind us that there is another way of interpreting reality, and that's the reality that is also highlighted when the pond calms.
Have you ever felt like you've done everything right, built the business, made smart investments, and yet there's still one piece missing? If you're someone who believes in Bitcoin but hasn't yet explored mining, let me introduce you to something that most people never even realize exists, and that is fully managed Bitcoin mining with Abundant Mines. We help high net worth individuals like you own industrial grade mining infrastructure without ever touching the machines. It's hands-free, professionally hosted, and designed to generate passive income by turning electricity into Bitcoin every single day. It's tax advantaged, it's asset backed, and for many of our clients, it's become one of the smartest moves that they've ever made in their investing career. So if you're ready to take the next step into real Bitcoin ownership, not just holding, but producing it at a discount, visit abundantminds.com. That's abundantminds.com, and see why this strategy is changing the game for serious investors. So in a sense, society, civilization, we rely on what we can often term useful fictions, things like law or money or economics or other systems that we use that are just tools of navigating the world, tools of navigating reality, but they're sort of limited frameworks. They don't capture the whole of what it is we're navigating. And if we can sort of disconnect ourselves from the belief that that's all that there is, that all that there is thinking through these different systems, that one, it's healthier, two, we have access to more information in total, and we get to see more of what is real, what is actually there in reality.
Yeah, and I think we have to be very careful about something in that regard, because I think we have gotten so used to thinking that thinking and logic and rationality is fully adequate in describing what reality is. But I would argue that thinking and money and engineering, they are a consequence of the abstract symbolic thinking part of our minds, and it is useful from a cooperating with one another and scaling society point of view. But it is not a helpful tool, all that thinking and all the words, to describe that more deeper fundamental truth that is underneath everything, right? And so I think we all have to become, at least I find this a lot in modernity, that I think we are not as humble as we should be in recognizing that while often, and I remember thinking this, I remember having conversations about this with my friend in college, that, knowledge itself is asymptotic, right? So you can be 99.999% sure of something scientifically, but you can never really be 100% sure, right? So you can imagine that knowledge and thinking and rationality, it can get very, 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 very close to the truth, but never quite there. And I actually think there's quite an irony in the world that if you let go of that attempt and you go the other direction, then you kind of teleport down to the other side of the axis and you've reached 100% understanding, right? That there's a word I really like. It's famous in the psychedelic communities of a noetic experience.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an experience that is felt, it is experienced in the body, and it is experienced as something that is undoubtedly and certainly true, right? It may not be something you can articulate with language, you can't share it with someone through words, but when you feel it, and you know it to be real, sometimes even more real than our everyday experience of reality. And I think that's something that modernity has quite forgotten, and I think it's worth respecting ancient cultures and our ancient ancestors and recognizing that I think they started to see that was being lost, and they tried to create rituals and write down ideas and teach practices that would help us remember.
So, someone listening to you so far would probably assume that you have the belief that it makes sense to kind of distance ourselves from technology in a way. But for those people who are listening who don't know you, you help people every day navigate one of the most sophisticated and leading edge technologies that we have the pleasure of interacting with, Bitcoin, and how to use it day to day, how to interact with it, which might seem kind of at odds with what you're talking about. But as I understand it, you don't think that technology is this kind of bad thing that's keeping us away from mindfulness, but it's just the wrong use of the tool, and that we are actually moving toward a way of interacting with and harnessing technology to return to this way of being that we've strayed so far away from, but is naturally much more healthy for us. Can you go a little bit deeper and kind of clarify, how do you feel about technology and its interaction with this more healthy state of mind that we all hope to be inhabiting?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'd like to zoom out really far, really quick. In Chinese philosophy, the way at which these subjects are approached, or at least the ones that I really appreciate, it's all about the Tao, right? And the Tao, in a rough English translation, thought about the way, right? And in this way, there is almost a directionality towards the flow of, both what humanity is doing, but also how one orients themselves to nature and the truth. And I then think it's interesting to contemplate, okay, what is that directionality? So I think that is best articulated in a scientific manner through, let's call it the laws of thermodynamics.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine that life forms on the earth as a consequence of the energy of the sun, and life forms as a dissipative structure to help facilitate the, let's say, the more efficient flow and production of entropy. A nice analogy might be, imagine a bathtub, and you have all this water filling that bathtub, and there's a lot of potential energy and it wants to drain down. So once you pull the drain, the water starts to flow downwards, and that's what nature wants the water to do. And in order to more efficiently facilitate that flow of energy, an orderly vortex is formed at the bottom of the drain so that the water can flow faster, right? So the earth and biology and life is the vortex, more efficiently dissipating the energy from the sun. All right, so you can think about that from a super simple point of view. You have plants, they absorb the energy from the sun, they grab that energy, they store it in electrons into sugars, and then animals eat those plants. They digest the sugars, grab those electrons, make them into more things in their body. Then animals are developed to eat those animals, and then they process those fats, and they, do the metabolism with the fat. And then there comes a human being, and we seek out energy in an even more sophisticated manner, right? You can imagine that, early wars, they were about food energy, right? We seek out soil and we fight over and deal with how to handle soil and grow food so we can have food energy. Modern conflicts are always or often over, oil energy. It's almost as if we are like flies to a light. And all we're doing is going around and we're tapping the earth until we find energy, and then it pops up, and then we grab the tree, we burn it down, we grab the oil, we burn it. We're always just combusting and dealing with and facilitating that flow of energy and entropy. And technology in general is meant to assist us in that manner.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest technologies are ones that help us facilitate and produce, we think of it as producing energy, right? You got a nuclear reactor, we have a lot of energy, but it's also helping, again, form that giant dissipative structure, which is the earth. or the life on Earth, I guess. And so, trying to bring that back to the way you asked me that question, imagine that I often like to call Bitcoin the entropy engine. It's a technology that we have invented, but also almost discovered that it's an incredibly helpful tool for us to find all the other pockets of energy that we haven't quite utilized on the planet yet and make use of them, right? We utilize wasteful energy more efficiently now because of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a giant leap forward in our ability to facilitate this flow of energy. And I also think that, again, if you thought of human society in general as, again, being aligned with that flow, the doll that I said earlier, you can imagine that Bitcoin, because of how much it aligns ourselves with that directional orientation, imagine as human being, as a person, you might sway from the path, right? You might have faulty days. You might have good days. There are some days where you're feeling so aligned and so in tune with yourself and so healthy and so full. And there are some days where that sways, right? So there is this path, and a human being might sway back and forth, some days good, some days bad of that path. Society is the same, right? So society has this directionality to it, aligned with the thermodynamic flow of the universe, but we sway. And sometimes we do good and sometimes we do bad. Sometimes we prosper and sometimes we hurt ourselves. And I think that because of the alignment that Bitcoin provides us in relationship to this thermodynamic flow, it will create it tightens us to that flow so that we sway less and we become more efficient, more prosperous. And like I said, one can think about the health of the body as another signal that we are being aligned. And so again, my fundamental intuition is that the more we are aligned with nature, the more healthy the body is going to be. And if there are aspects of technology or modernity in general that are hindering our health, then as we move forward in this arrow of time, and as we continue to invent technology that help us facilitate that energy flow, we will realize that what is actually healthy is that we use it. Like you said, it's a tool and it has a double-edged sword, and we just learn to use it in the correct way so that we learn to be healthy, let's say, live more aligned with nature. But it's because of, let's say, even to simplify it even more, right? Imagine, I think a lot of us in the Bitcoin world, we imagine incredible economic prosperity because of Bitcoin, right? It's not like, and it's not because of Bitcoin itself, but it's because Bitcoin as a sound money creates price signals that make the economy more efficient. And so there's abundance for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. There's abundant energy for everyone. There's abundant goods and services for everyone. And that just creates wealth everywhere. And you can imagine that, you ask most people say, well, if you had just a near infinite amount of wealth, what would you do? And a simple answer might be, well, I'd go find a beach somewhere and I just enjoy the sun, right? To me, that is very real and very symbolic of what happens when we have such an abundance of wealth, is that everyone will then seek what is most mentally, physically, and spiritually fulfilling.
So if I could restate back to you the way that I understood that, one of our laws of thermodynamics is that an open system will seek to channel as much energy as possible. And whether you're talking about a human body, a civilization, or a planet, those are open systems looking to channel as much energy as possible in the most effective way. And throughout periods of evolution, history, as you mentioned, life is a way of channeling solar energy in different ways that creates a more orderly system than if it's just exhausting into nothing or changing forms into nothing. And that we, in a sense, have evolved as humanity to channel more and more, not just physical energy like electrons, but also economic energy, informational energy, and that at some point it wasn't as obvious for, let's say the last 2000 years up until the information age. We got to a point of having too much informational energy to properly channel through just the vehicle of our minds, and it overburdened our thinking minds to the point where we needed to invent these outside of our body ways of channeling both physical energy in the case of Bitcoin and then informational energy and productivity in the case of AI, so that we could sort of offload but still make use of the potential energy that wants to run through that system. And then in some sense, trying to burden ourselves with being the only channel for all of that information and all of that energy is what leads to unhealth or disease. And that the more that we can offload portions, at least, the majority of that responsibility of channeling that energy and that information, that we return to a healthy state of homeostasis and being able to properly channel all of those resources. Am I right, or am I missing something?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I would say a slight caveat that I think that this slow pollution in the mind has always been happening, right? It's not necessarily something that was suddenly introduced with modernity, but obviously as we are recognizant that technology has accelerated, so has the sickness, right? But I mean, there's a quote somewhere in that book. I couldn't find it quickly, but there's Lao Tzu is an ancient philosopher of Chinese. He's around the same time of the Socrates and Aristotle and stuff like that, and he has a line that talks about how I believe it's something around the wise men of old had no attachment to themselves, right? So even him, thousands of years ago, was looking back and going, wow, ancient people were way more in tune than I am today. And now we look back at him as like a wise sage, right? And so I think that progression has always been happening. It's the story of human history. And it just accelerated with technology, but also, the reason why life is so defined today by the computer is because the computer is the tipping point where we invented something that can actually, let's say, alleviate the disease in a truly successful manner.
So if this all goes well and people harmoniously interact with the tools available to them, what does the positive vision of the future look like if we are to adopt a more healthy way of interacting with this technology? Or what does it do for us?
I think the humbling answer would be to say that it's not possible for us today to even comprehend what that world looks like. Let me try to articulate that through a metaphor. Often when people ask me about Bitcoin and the extent at which I think Bitcoin is going to solve problems in the world, I say, well, imagine that money and language are fundamentally a very similar thing, right? They are both stranger cooperation scaling technologies, and they have helped human beings cooperate and scale society in a peaceful manner. They help us cooperate. Imagine a world where everyone on the planet couldn't speak the same language, right? So everyone spoke a different language. You can imagine that is just complete and utter mayhem and chaos, right? Everyone's beating each other on the head and stabbing each other and robbing each other. It's just awful. And then, snap of a finger, everyone's speaking the same language, and say, whoa, 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 can we just talk it out, please? Peace would just flood the world. And what I think is happening is that you could imagine that society has had both language and money as a means of which we cooperate. But it wasn't until the invention of Bitcoin that we had a unified language of money. So we've been living in a world where, yes, we all speak the same language, but the other half of the coin, we've been disjointed. We've had incredible amount of violence, violence, war, murder, theft, everywhere. And the peace and the prosperity that we're going to experience once we've all switched over to that unified language, I think is so profoundly outside of what we have ever seen in human history, to the point where I guess it'd be really silly for me to predict what that would look like, because I live in the dark ages to what that time will be.
How do you personally integrate what you talk about in the book into your life? What are some things that you do? Because I know that you interact with technology all the time. You use it to support yourself in work. I know that it's an incredible tool for gaining access to information and the ability to improve your life. What are some things that you do to sort of temper the negative impacts and align yourself with the positive vision of what you think this can be when we properly have it placed in our lives?
My relationship with technology is always evolving, especially recently, now that I'm thinking a lot more about how light influences the body. And so that rabbit hole is quite deep, and I don't have good answers for them yet. But as I think about meditation in the mind, I think a lot about how, obviously, first of all, I think practicing some kind of mindfulness technique in your daily life is really important, right? Now, whatever that looks like for a person is going to be different. However they approach that is going to be different. But taking the time out of the day to train the mind to have that single pointed awareness and to not follow the impulses of that, monkey mind is very, very important. And, it's, I like to think of it as it would be silly for us to not recognize that the body needs physical training, because in nature, we were always physically active, and therefore we recognize how important that is for health. But I think mindfulness is like going to the gym for the mind, and it's very important to do. So, but of course, you can have a relationship with technology and still do that. But I guess personally, I also try to stay very away from, I have my relationship with social media is very distant. I try to stay away from those type of things that make me want to impulsively grab my phone. And, you find this a lot where someone in silence with nothing to do feels as if they have an impulse that they need to do something. Oh, I'm going to grab my phone and I'm going to scroll because I need to fill my mind with thought, right? Or whatever it is that you're filling your mind with. And I find that to be a very unhealthy impulse, right? It's good to just be in silence, to be with yourself, to be with your mind, and then, even more deeply to learn to not even have the mind wander, but to just focus on the breath or something like that, right? But I personally enjoy finding that in all kinds of other means, right? A cold plunge or a sauna to me is also a kind of mindfulness, because you're sitting in you're taking time out of your day to, when done for a certain amount of time, starts to become very uncomfortable, and your body just wants you to stop and leave. And you remind your mind, or like you remind yourself, that that's just a thought, that it's not real, and you can just keep persevering, and you change the relationship with your mind. I find fasting like that too, right? You try to do one day without eating, and you'll sit on your couch and you'll say, man, I'd love to just go to the fridge right now and get a snack. And you see that thought and you go, and you bring it back to the discipline of not doing it, right? And so I think that outside of just changing your relationship with technology, it's actually a changing your relationship with your mind, in the sense that you pursue discipline more often. And even though modernity provides you with so many comforts, that you don't just pursue the comforts because you can, that you recognize that pursuing the discipline and the suffering is actually a very healthy and important part of, the mind, body, and spirit.
So we've talked about this before, that until Bitcoin came around, it was hard to even see what existed before with clear eyes, because you didn't have this very clear delineation of the next stage. It's almost like every new stage of technology or advancement lends more clarity to the ones before it.
Mm-hmm.
And so Bitcoin, of course, holds up a lens of what has previously existed for monetary systems, for economic cooperation. But it also has this effect on people who spend a lot of time in the space of re-examining health practices, mindfulness practices, different ways of being in the world. How would you describe the journey of for yourself and then maybe advice for somebody else who's just kind of interested in Bitcoin, just sort of like discovering it as this probably a potential investment or an asset class, but not thinking of it as a lens of re-examining the world that they thought they knew? What would your thoughts be on that for somebody who's just kind of falling down this rabbit hole for the first time?
That's a very interesting question because, like I said earlier, there is an interesting phenomena amongst people who start to interact with Bitcoin that they start to manifest these other kinds of ideas or behaviors or mindsets or what have you. I'm not so sure, though, I have any advice because I think it is something that is organic. And I think that the only advice I would give is it's more about studying and interacting with Bitcoin itself. I think that, one can look at it like a financial thing that you buy and a number goes up, but I find that to be a very small, shallow aspect of what this thing is. And when you start using it, when you start spending it, when you start handling your wallet, when you start running your own node, you start studying the technology itself, but also all of the subsequent consequences, like you were saying, I think each person should just ride that wave as naturally as they can, and they'll find out on their own.
What has it meant for you? How have you changed through this? And how long, I guess, when was your first exposure? How long ago was that? And what do you feel like has changed the most since your journey?
So it's difficult because, again, I got into this subject already just engulfed in Austrian economic literature and all those type of ideas. And imagine that I was already simultaneously becoming very interested in a more natural way of thinking about my life and health. And I first heard about Bitcoin in high school at that time. I dismissed it then, though, because I heard internet money and I knew that money had to be scarce. And I was also of the impression that everything on the internet can be copy and paste and duplicated. And so I thought, well, that's really cool that some, anarchist libertarian coder is trying to make money on the internet, but it needs to be scarce, so it probably can't work. And of course, if I Googled it for 5 seconds, I would have realized I was wrong, but it wasn't until I was in college that I learned you could mine it. And so I had at that time built a computer for gaming, and I had an extra GPU slot. And so I bought another GPU. At that time, ASICs were becoming competitive. I couldn't really economically mine Bitcoin, so I was mining Ethereum and converting it into Bitcoin. And that's when I started to study the technology, and I realized, imagine at this time, I'm still very much into my Austrian economic ideas, but I didn't really understand how to implement them in the world, right? Often people will say, well, you have all these cool ideas, but, so what? How are you going to deal with these problems? And I wouldn't have the answer. And then I started to look at Bitcoin, and I realized that was the answer. It was a technological innovation that was required. And so the thing about it transforming me, though, is that I was already very, very deep into these ideas before. It's, to me, what is actually just comforting is that when back then I felt very alone, very little people could resonate with me about, the problems of fiat money. Very few people even could discuss with me the ideas of Austrian economics. And as I get more involved with Bitcoin, as I see more and more people kind of finding this, it's more just a comforting thing that I can see. If I were to think about the era of time, it's obvious that this idea is spreading rather than the other way around. And so It's hard to say how it's changed me in a way. To me, this has defined my entire young adult life.
I don't expect that this is the last book that you'll ever write, but since it was the first, I imagine that it was an experience of its own. What do you feel like you've either uncovered about yourself or discovered or seen evolve as you went through the process of writing your first book?
Well, first of all, writing is an incredibly helpful thing to digest thoughts. After writing the book, you write a book, it takes a long time to write a book. You reread your book over and over again. You kind of get tired of writing, and you just are so happy to get it out the door. But as soon as it's out the door, it's not like the learning stops. It's not like the thinking stops. And I find myself immediately getting back into writing because I have more thoughts to digest. And simply writing, even if it's a short blog post, is so helpful for fleshing out ideas and structuring them in a coherent manner. So I would say that, while writing a book is very enjoyable and I feel very proud to have released my idea to the world, part of the book, in retrospect, is also just a very, it was helpful for myself to think through all my ideas and just digest them. And then, it just so happens that, you can sell it on the internet kind of thing. Right. But I think that's like the biggest reflection. I mean, the truth is especially as I was writing that book, I spent a lot of time reading words of ancient people. And something I was humbled by was to realize that, in some ways, I don't actually find my ideas to be new at all. That I think I add a scientific, flavor to it, and that's new, I suppose. But the fundamental idea is incredibly old. I think it's actually one of the oldest ideas. And it's one of the first things that very deep thinkers were trying to say. And that's a humbling thing, because then you start to think about, well, if these ideas have been here the whole time, then what really is it that makes them not propagate? I suppose I kind of have an answer to that, is because I don't think it's an intellectual thing to propagate, that it's something experienced, right? You think, in the West, we try to spread, these type of concepts through books, right? And the most influential books of the West are books that are written to say, hey, look, here's a way at which you can, reflect upon these concepts. But when I think about the East, yes, there are some poems like the Tao Te Ching and, books like Zhuangzi. But, if you really wanted to know it, you'd climb on top of a mountain, you walk up to a master, and the master say, okay, cool, you want to know? And you, yes, please, master, please give me the answer. Okay, sit. Right? There's no words that master can give you. It's all experiential. It's all done through personal practice. And I think that brings an incredibly great challenge. Here I am trying to articulate this idea, but I know that fundamentally speaking, it's not something I can articulate with words. And no matter how amazing the writing of the book is, it's only something that we can all experience personally. And I suppose the only thing I'm trying to do is remind people that that's there.
So one of the ways that we can have an impact on people is doing exactly what you've done, which is memorializing our ideas and sharing them. But more often than not, it's through what we do during our daily lives that we get to have this material impact on people in real time. And I know I personally was drawn into Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining with the initial desire of this, profit-seeking motive. And of course, that's one of these core desires that people seek to get with that exploration. But what I found was this love of teaching people about how the world works and all of the systems that underpin it, and using this vehicle of Bitcoin mining as a way to teach people about things that they probably weren't even looking for, but through this vehicle of helping them make money in something, I get to have this fringe benefit of them being exposed to something that likely can change their lives if they're open to it. In what you do day to day, you're helping people specifically in our business onboard to Bitcoin in many different ways, from setting up mining pools to custody to just thinking through the asset. Other than helping them navigate a technology, what do you see as sort of like the second order effect that you are most happy to see, or that you most want to occasion in somebody? Because I think of you as not just someone who's helping people, but a true teacher. And so I imagine you're always looking for a way for them to absorb something below the surface that goes beyond just the obvious, hey, I'm going to help you get set up with how to use this thing we call Bitcoin today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're honestly bringing to mind a very interesting parallel for me right now, right? Like I said, I think there's something about Bitcoin that is experienced. Using it over time brings up thoughts and feelings and behaviors that are not normal in a, let's call it a traditional financial world. So, again, I really do think Bitcoin is incredibly powerful. It's a kind of allodial title, inviolable private property. It's something that I feel great pride in helping someone take hold of for the first time. I find it incredibly fulfilling to empower people that way. And it's not like I need to, highlight it at all, but I know from personal experience that when you can hold that kind of property in your own hands, it does something to you. I think, at least personally, I think it calls upon more ancient feelings that I am sure that my ancestors felt when they had things that they held that they were truly theirs. And so, again, you're very kind, but I like to think I'm doing something very simple. I'm just teaching them how to use the tool, and the tool will give everything else.
If you could paint a vision of what you want your impact to be in this lifetime, through this book, through your work, what do you want to see be occasioned as a result of you having been in the world?
Again, I think that there is a very deep and long topic that human beings have struggled to talk about and communicate forever. And that topic goes by many names, and it's probably best just to not give a name to it at all. And I think that in our modern world, we are having a kind of meaning crisis. I think we are so detached from that it is causing great disharmony. And if anything, I would just like to help one person connect with that once again.
Well, in our exploration of the ineffable, I think you have really effed it up, my man.
I'm glad.
So the book is called The Ancient Way of the Mind, with the subtitle, How Modern Thinking Blinds Us from the Wisdom of the Past. People can find it on Amazon. Where can they keep up with you? Where else can they follow your work? And what are you working on right now?
Honestly, some of the best way to keep up with me is probably through following Abundant Mind stuff, because I really don't have much of a social media following. You can find me on Nostr if you use Nostr. If you wanted to find my NPub, it is on my Twitter account that I don't really use, which is at Bright Minds Co. But what I'm working on now is I am helping mine as much Bitcoin as I can. And again, I can't help myself but dive deeper down this rabbit hole of nature and health. And so I'm also doing a lot of research and writing about how our metabolic health as it relates to mitochondria and other types of bodily processes are influenced by light, water, and magnetism. And you can find those writings and research on my Nostr as well if you use Nostr. So,
love it. We'll link those socials in the description. We'll link the book as well. And Sydney, I have thoroughly enjoyed getting a chance to sit down with you and have this conversation. It is a pleasure for me to know you. I'm grateful to call you a friend, and thanks for sharing your time and your wisdom with people.
Likewise. Thanks, Bo.